This is the reading and reading guide hints for chapters 4 through 6, starting on page 17. The eye looks, but it is the mind that sees. Mama once said the most wonderful thing about being young is our ability to make things normal. That whatever life does to us, no matter how strange, it isn't long before insanity seems ordinary, as if upside down is the only way things should be. That didn't make sense to me at first, but over the next 4 years after the wall went up, I saw it happen more and more. Most children barely noticed the wall any longer. They played hoops beneath the eyes of armed border guards in their watchtowers, rolled marbles in the shade of the wall, and learned to do as they were told without asking questions. I was 12 years old now, and the older I got, the more separate I felt from the other kids my age, because I always noticed the wall. Always. Over the past 4 years, I had learned to read the guards high up in the watchtowers and know when they were looking and when they had turned away. I knew when and where the guards did their patrols along the border and where they didn't go often. And more than anything, I knew that nothing happening to us was normal. Okay, so your first question, your reading guide, is just analysis of this quote that the most wonderful thing about being young is the ability to make things normal. Now, Goethe's mother thinks this because she says, if you've lived a certain way for a long time, then all of a sudden things change, it's harder to adjust. But if you're younger and you grow up with the expectations, it's easier for you. Goethe doesn't agree with this. And so the question is, what do you think of this quote? How do younger generations create, so you could create change, or accept change? And then I said, give an example. So I know for me, when I was growing up, there was still smoking allowed in restaurants, and there would be smoking and non-smoking sections. So a way that the younger generations had created change was by protesting and trying to get lawmakers to change those laws to say that, hey, secondhand smoke is real and we shouldn't be allowed to smoke in restaurants. So that would be a way that when I was younger, change had been created and that it was very easy for me to accept that change and to think that, well, of course, it's normal. So that would be an example that I would write about. You can write about an example that maybe you've seen or you've heard people talk about the way that things used to be different and how younger generations have changed what is considered normal. Okay. The only one who really understood that was Fritz, who said it was because I had Papa's blood in me. Not a single morning had passed in the last 4 years when I didn't think of my father and the courage he would expect from me. My walk to school passed very close to the wall, or as close as we were allowed to get anyway. I usually made the walk alongside my only real friend, Anna, who was as timid and shy as I was bold and outspoken. Where I had blonde hair, round eyes, and an athletic body, Anna had darker hair, eyes that nearly disappeared when she smiled, and a thin frame that looked as if she needed to be fed. She worked very hard to stay out of trouble, which made her an ideal friend for me. Unfortunately, my ability to avoid trouble was less skilled. I probably wasn't the perfect friend for her. Today felt uncommonly cold. I was enduring it and hoping not to arrive at school frostbitten. As usual between us, Anna had made the wiser choice. She was wrapped in scarves until there wasn't much visible except for her eyes and mouth. I'd barely remembered my coat. There's a pioneer meeting today, Anna said through what looked like 18 layers of wool. Are you going? I groaned. We went to school to study letters and numbers, then stayed at school as members of the pioneers, and learned why freedom was overrated, why individuality was bad, and why we must always avoid the evil influences of the West, such as fancy clothes and Beatles music. I loved the Beatles, but not even Anne knew about that. That secret was only for Fritz and me. He had bought one of their albums, smuggled in through the black market, and he and I listened to it very low on nights when the streets were crowded and noisy. Of course I'm going, I said. Not attending could bring my mother a visit from the school administrators, and none of us wanted that. Over the last 4 years, we'd already had too many questions from the school, the police, and even the Stasi about my father. Nothing in East Germany frightened me more than the Stasi. We always knew they were there, even when we couldn't see them. They existed to protect our country from enemies, either foreign spies trying to get in or traitors who wanted to get out. My family wasn't either, but that didn't mean we were safe. After my father left, I had thought there'd be no need for them to visit us anymore, but they obviously disagreed. They had last come almost 2 years ago, late at night, long after we should have been in bed. I think their timing was meant to make us nervous, and from the looks on my family's faces, it worked. Fritz and I had sat on either side of Mama on the couch. While she answered their questions, I kept an eye on their weapons. If they'd only come to ask questions, why did they bring guns? The Stasi officer had sat in Papa's old chair. Who had sat in Papa's old chair was on his second cigarette before the hard questions came. Has eldest Lowe returned to East Berlin? I was sure I could hear Mama's heart pounding beside me. Or maybe it was mine, because the officer's tone made it clear that he was no friend to my father. Mama shook her head, and if she was trying to answer in a calm voice, it didn't work. I haven't seen my husband since the wall went up. Good, the officer said. We will arrest him if he does return. He took a long drag on a cigarette. Does he continue to work against the government? He never did, Mama said. Another man who stood by the door walked forward with photos that he placed in her hands. I leaned over just enough to see an old picture of my father and Herr Kraus, both with stacks of leaflets in their hands. I didn't know what was on them, but from the terse expression on the officer's face, it was obviously something more than party invitations or store coupons. Mama quickly handed the photos back. I have no idea what my husband is doing now. He does not involve us in those activities and never did. He never involved Mama or me. But Fritz hadn't looked at the pictures, and I wondered if that was because he already knew what my father had been doing. Has Aldous Lowe tried to contact you? The officer asked. Mama shook her head, but when she paused for too long, I spoke for her. We have no letters, and you cut the phone lines to the west and on barbed wire Sunday. The officer turned his attention to me. His eyes were like ice on my bare skin. So there's a simile there. I cut some of them myself, child. Does that anger you? Of course it did. But he had the gun, so I only looked down while Mama made humble apologies for my boldness and gripped my wrist like a vice. The Stasi left soon afterward, but even now, 2 years later, I still felt a chill whenever I thought of them. Since that night, Mama carefully made sure we did everything that might be expected of a good East German family. We waved our flags at the parades and smiled at the leaders of the GDR, German Democratic Republic, our communist government. Fritz joined the Free German Youth and made plans to enroll at the university one day. And at the beginning of every school year, I joined the Pioneers. With Anna at my side, I participated in their meetings and activities, chanted the slogan, "Be ready, always ready," and wore the blue scarf and white shirt uniform on every holiday when it was required. If anyone was watching us, and we suspected they were, my family now looked as loyal as the best of them. All right, so one of your questions is, why is this their slogan? Why is the Pioneer slogan, "Be ready, always ready"? And there's textual evidence, things that Goethe explains, that can help us make an educated guess about what they're supposed to always be ready for. And we also learn some background information about the Cold War. So in 2 sentences, and using evidence, explain what you think they're supposed to always be ready for exactly. Gerda, stop staring at the wall, Anna whispered to me. Do you think the soldiers don't notice? I think it's too cold for them to bother with me, I said. They watch the university students and the men whose families are on the other side. They don't watch 12-year-old girls on their way to school. Yes, they do, Anna insisted. Turn away, please. Look at anything else. At what? I gestured around me. There's nothing else to see. With all of this gray around us, it's hard to remember we live in a world of color. We called it communist gray. It was the color of our buildings, our markets, our streets, the color of the wall. Even the skies were gray today. Somehow the GDR must have figured out how to bleach that out too. But because I knew it bothered Anna, I stopped looking, and she and I fell into a conversation about the latest hair fashions. It was the sort of conversation two ordinary girls might have on a perfectly ordinary day, even if one of those girls had her mind on something else entirely, as I almost always did. I became so distracted by my thoughts, in fact, that I barely noticed when Anna stopped talking. I probably wouldn't have realized she had stopped walking either, if she had not spoken my name. Gerda, look. I stopped and turned back to her. To my surprise, Anna stood directly facing the wall. Gerda, is that your brother? Several meters away, across a large scar of land that had become forbidden territory, a boy stood alone on a platform behind the wall in West Berlin. I usually tried to ignore the Westerners on those platforms because they made me feel like an exhibit in a zoo. I didn't want their looks of pity or sadness, or especially the occasional homesick expression, to return to this lesser half of the city. But the boy on the platform seemed to be staring directly at me, and I squinted to see him better. It had been 4 years since I had seen Dominic, and he would be 14 now. Mama kept a picture of him in the front room, and I mentally compared that with the boy now facing me. His face had lengthened and narrowed, but the hair peeking out from his knitted cap seemed about the right color. I would know him if I saw his eyes, but that was impossible from this distance. Still, there was something in his posture, the way he held one shoulder higher than the other. Dominic used to do that. I remembered because my mother always reminded him to stand up straight. It had been a long time since my smile had stretched so wide. That's him, I said. That's my brother. He seemed to recognize me too, or at least he waved. I raised my hand back at him, although such a simple gesture was far too casual for the importance of this moment. For almost 4 years, neither of us had heard a word about the other, and all we could do now was wave in silence. Does something over there interest you? I turned to see a border guard standing right behind Anna and me, close enough that I could see the stitching of his black gloves. He was shorter than average, with white blonde hair shaved so close to his head that he almost looked bald. He was several years older than Fritz, but there were a lot of patches on his uniform, so I gathered he was more than a low-level officer. His name, stitched onto the uniform, was Mueller, and he stared down as if frightening me entertained him. Mueller had come up so quietly that neither of us heard him, but I should have known. Grenzers often patrolled this area. Of course, my wave to Dominic would have caught one's attention. Beside me, Anna had turned to stone, or something like it. She wasn't moving, and possibly wasn't breathing either. Not me. I wanted to look up as far as his eyes, stare him in the face, and tell him there was no crime in looking across the wall. More than anything, I wanted to show him I wasn't afraid. Except I was. Mueller's rifle hung around his shoulder directly in front of me, and he had one hand on the stock. Maybe it was only my imagination, but I could have sworn that the rifle smelled like blood, as if he had used it on someone before. He lifted it over his head and moved his other hand to the trigger. I asked you a question, Mueller said. Who were you waving at? I turned back, but Dominic had disappeared by then, so I lowered my eyes and said to the officer, It was nobody, sir. You'd better remember that next time someone over there waves at you. He let the cold metal barrel brush against my cheek, then ran it beneath my chin and pushed my head up to face him. Because those who get too curious about the other side sometimes get a taste of my bullets. Verstehst du? That means, do you understand? I stared into his icy blue eyes and tried not to let any hatred show in mine. Yes, I whispered. I understand exactly who you are. Then move along. Don't let me catch you stopping here again. I whispered another thanks to him, which almost immediately began to eat at my sense of justice. Then I grabbed Anna's arm. As terrified as I had been, she seemed worse. Her skin was deathly pale, and she leaned hard against me as we walked away. When Officer Mueller was out of our sight, Anna released a gasp of air, then said to me, "Promise me you'll never stop there again, no matter who you see on the other side. Promise me, Gerda." Though her reddened eyes begged me to agree with her, I couldn't. Maybe I could promise to be more careful next time I stopped, but that was all. I didn't tell her that. She'd have launched into a fit of hysterics, which would have brought on Mueller's attentions again. So I clutched her arm tighter as we continued to walk. My heart was pounding, just as hers surely was, but for an entirely different reason. All I could think was that after 4 long years, I'd finally seen my brother, and I hoped it wasn't for the last time. All right, so a lot to digest there. She sees her brother for the first time. She has an interaction with the Grenzner, the soldier who guards the wall. So the last part of this study guide is what questions you have after this chapter. Come up with at least one, something that you are wondering about that interaction, maybe what will come next. A question about the soldiers, perhaps, or why was there a platform for people on the west to see into the east? And we're going to keep going with chapter 5. The Germans and I no longer speak the same language. Since both Mama and Fritz worked through the afternoons, it was sometimes my job after school to stop by the market for food. Most things were gone by then, but Mama said that made choosing easier. This was true. Often by the time I got there, the choice was between red cabbage or white cabbage, as if I cared which one went into my basket. Today I wandered the aisles, hoping something more exciting would be available. I could afford it if there was. The government kept the prices of everything we might need very low. It's just that the shelves were always more empty than full, and what was on them looked or tasted as gray as everything else. The good food was called benders, because if you had something worth trading, the clerk would bend down under the counter to get it for you. But Mama didn't want us bargaining for food. Just take what is offered on the shelves and come home quickly, she always said. More than anything, I longed for a banana. We used to have them years ago, and for my 12th birthday last fall, Fritz had bought one for me off the black market. I still remember its taste. Finally, I got some chicken, a few potatoes, and of course, cabbage. I also picked up a few cans of cola, proudly made in East German factories. Fritz thought it left a bitter aftertaste and said one day he'd smuggle in some real Western cola for us. After that, he said, "You'll never want our cola again." "If that's true, then don't get it," I had responded. "It'll be one less thing that I can buy." Once in line, I stared at the people ahead of me, watching them watch nothing at all because it was safer that way. Mama described us as practical, durable people, which I think she meant as a compliment, though I never took it that way. Our strength came from the collective. Every school teacher I'd ever had said that until it played in my head like a skipping record. Individuality was a weakness, a sickness of the West. So we all walked in step, eyes ahead, and with conversations at a minimum. We all smiled, but not much, and frowned, but rarely cried. Nobody could succeed here, but most people around me seemed to be okay with that. It meant they wouldn't fail either. I didn't want to be like them. And at the same time, I was beginning to forget how to be different, how to be my own self. It was the feeling of being swallowed up, and I hated it. That was all I thought about as I hurried home with my groceries. We lived on the 4th floor of a drab apartment building that looked more or less like all the other apartment buildings. That wasn't an accident. Beautiful things were signs of individuality. Wherever possible, Mama had tried to provide some beauty inside the apartment, but still, our furnishings were spare and simple. Okay, so this first part of the chapter is really putting a heavy emphasis on the ideas that the government enforced about the collective being good and individuality being bad. And they said that individuality is a sickness of the West, a weakness of the West. And that was their perspective. So this first part of the reading guide for chapter 5, it asks you to think about in what ways does the West have individuality in comparison to what Gerda is describing. So Gerda is saying there's only certain foods available. They're saying that the government is controlling the price of everything, and they also control what is available in the supermarkets. she's talking about things that are available, like even just the colors that exist. So, in what ways does the West celebrate individuality in comparison to what she's saying? That's the first question. With little to look at inside, I went to my room and stared down to the small garden space below. I had buried the peel from Fritz's banana there, hoping it would sprout into a tree this spring. I knew it wasn't possible, but I still looked every day. And when the tree wasn't there, I always turned my attention to the wall. If I got the angle just right, I could see into West Berlin. There's nothing but greed and selfishness on the other side, my school teacher often told us. If you try to look, it shows nothing but greed and selfishness in your own heart. Well, I was greedy and selfish then, because I could never help but look. I couldn't see much, but it somehow seemed brighter across the wall, as if the sun gave more of its light to the west. Maybe the people there were more selfish, I thought, because we needed that sunlight far more than they did. Then some movement at the wall caught my attention, and when I saw what it was, I laughed. Rabbit had been trapped in the death strip. A rabbit had become trapped in the death strip. They often did, but it was always amusing to see the Grenzners come running to try to chase it away. They didn't like the prints the rabbits left behind their perfectly smooth dirt. Over the past 4 years, what started as a simple barbed wire fence had evolved into an entire system designed to stop, capture, or kill anyone who tried to get through. In most places in East Germany, even before reaching the wall, there was an open border area that nobody would dare get close to unless they had a death wish. People who encountered the Grenzners there on patrol often disappeared, sometimes for days, sometimes forever. Behind it was the backland wall, which I passed by each day. It was a simple concrete wall that surrounded West Berlin, making that free half of the city an island within communist East Germany. What I knew of the area behind the backland came only from the glimpses I saw from my window, or occasionally from Anna's bedroom if she didn't catch me looking, and from what Fritz told me he had seen while out on bricklaying jobs. Beyond the backland wall was another barbed wire fence that might have been electrified, which I figured was bad enough, but Fritz thought it was something else. He believed touching that wire sent a signal to the guards in the watchtowers. If it was true, that would be worse. Past that was what we called the death strip. The government hadn't given it that name, but they didn't discourage its use either. Soldiers and fierce dogs often patrolled it. Barriers and deep trenches were set up to stop any vehicles that tried to crash through. And the dirt was left smooth, so on the rare chance that someone did get that far, it would be easy to follow him. Soldiers were ordered to shoot on sight and to shoot to kill. They never hid that fact. And they had done it before. Western television broadcast the pictures of border guards carrying dead bodies out of the death strip or pulling them from the water. I'd seen it myself, or at least when we could catch the television signal here. Our government would then respond with ridiculous excuses such as heart failure or a swimming day gone bad. While heart failure didn't cause bleeding wounds ripped through a person's gut, and nobody ever swam the Spree River for fun, they had tried to escape and had failed. Reminders of our own fate, should we try it too? There were some successes, no doubt, though we didn't hear about them as often. Those who escaped usually kept quiet about it. They didn't want their loved ones left behind in the East to be punished. Eventually, the rabbit hopped away, or perhaps someone I couldn't see chased it off. I never could figure out how the rabbits got inside in the first place, since they couldn't pass through solid concrete. They would have had to dig a tunnel underneath. Even the animals wanted to leave East Berlin, I supposed. I would have kept watching for the rabbit, but Mama called me in to supper. I came in and plunked down beside Fritz, but right away it was clear his mind was somewhere else. He picked at the food until Mama finally set down her spoon and said, "You're quiet tonight. What's wrong?" Okay, so the rabbit's in the death strip. Somehow it got beyond the wall, right? And she's kind of theorizing how this happened. And this is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when the author gives you some information that hints to something that will happen later. So my question is, how does the rabbit being in the death strip and finding its way there. How does that foreshadow in this novel? And make a prediction based on that foreshadowing. He shrugged. It's just a hard day, that's all. No, that wasn't all. I knew it, even if she didn't. Since the wall had gone up, Fritz never told Mama anything that made her more worried or sad than she already was. So if he went as far as to admitting it had been a hard day, that meant something awful had happened, or soon would. Fritz met my eyes and offered a grim smile, but he looked away when Mama turned to me and asked, "What about your day, Gerda? You had a pioneer meeting?" "Yes." I reached for another slice of bread. They had an announcement. A few days ago, the first person ever to do a spacewalk was outside the spacecraft for over 12 minutes. He's Russian. They want us to be proud of that, though I don't see how that has anything to do with Germany. They want us to be proud because it means the East beat the West, nothing more. Fritz's tone was more biting than usual. Something was definitely bothering him. So that is the space race, which we talked a little bit about in the Cold War. We wanted to go to space before them. They did ultimately beat us to space. We beat them to the moon. I decided to leave it alone. After all, sometimes I didn't want to talk either. "Where's the butter?" he asked. I shrugged. Food shortages. Butter never lasted long on the shelves. Trying to distract us both, Mama asked, "Did anything else happen today, Gerda?" Immediately I thought of having seen Dominic. Ever since that moment, I had debated whether to tell them. Would Mama be happy that I had seen him, or sad because she had not? Just take a second here to reflect. What do you know about Gerda's mom? Do you think that that Gerda should tell her mom, or do you think that she shouldn't? Based on the things you kind of already know about Gerda's mom and how she reacts. She does decide to tell her, so let's keep reading. I didn't know the answer to those questions, but I was certain of one thing. If either Mama or Fritz had been the one to see Dominic, I would want them to tell me. I hesitated a moment. Then in only a whisper, I said, "I saw Dom this morning." The room became as still as the grave. And I almost wondered if Mama thought that's where I said he was. Shouldn't she be asking how he looked, whether Papa was with him, or how I had felt in this moment? But with a stiff voice, she only asked, "Where?" "On my way to school, on one of the platforms in the west. I think he was waiting for me. He knew I would be there." Mama frowned and the lines in her face deepened. "We've talked about this before. You shouldn't be looking over the wall. If the Grenzners caught you—" One had. I still got a pit in my stomach when I thought about Mueller's rifle against my cheek, but I certainly couldn't tell her that. Instead, I faced her scolding with my own anger. "We wouldn't have to worry about the Grenzners if you'd let us leave with Papa that night." It wasn't the first time we'd had this fight. "We all want to be together." Mom's voice was tired. "But it's not possible, you know that." Yes, I did. Some days, all I thought about was the ways to get my father back here, or how we might get over to him and Dominic. But never once could I come up with an answer. The wall was larger, stronger, and far more deadly than anyone my age could challenge. I hated that wall, and resented my mother every time she tried to make me accept it. "Did you hear me?" I almost shouted now. But that was better than tears. "I saw Dom today, your son." Fritz tried to calm me. "Gerda, you don't—" But it was too late. I slammed my fork back on the table and ran to my room. Father would have understood why I waved at Dominic, but Mama didn't. Sometimes I thought she was just like everyone else here, blind to the fact that there was an entire world out there beyond the wall. Maybe Mama no longer cared about Papa and Dominic, or had forgotten them entirely. I never would. So she feels very stuck, very misunderstood, of course. And she is showing some really strong characteristics here by the things that she's saying, the things she's doing, the thoughts that she's having, the effects that she has on others, her effects on Anna even. So what are some characteristics that she's showing? And some of it's direct. They directly tell us how bold she is. But you can also use that as something that they're indirectly showing us. You just need to show the evidence. What are the things that she's saying, doing, and thinking that show that boldness? All right, chapter 6. the last chapter for this video. We start off with a quote that I'm asking you to analyze. It says, "The wall will be standing in 50 and even in 100 years if the reasons for it are not removed." And that is from the First Secretary of East Germany. So what this quote, he's putting blame on the people for the wall, right? So what specifically is he blaming? Why did the wall go up? And what is he saying? He's saying the wall will continue to be up as long as we need it. So using your background knowledge, using what you know about East Berlin and the people there, the reasons the wall went up, using what you know about the Cold War, what is he talking about? Who is he really blaming? We're going to keep reading. It was a Beatles night. Fritz lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, while I sat cross-legged on the floor with a book I had given up on reading. In the background, John Lennon harmonized with Paul McCartney as they sang philosophies of love in a language I barely understood. If it weren't for the Beatles, I wouldn't have known any English at all. For me, it's the lyrics. Fritz had taken an English course in school and spoke it much better than I did. The things they write could never be played here. Of course not, I said with a smile. It'd corrupt us. Personally, I preferred the tunes, although mostly I liked the Beatles simply because we weren't supposed to like them, or, for that matter, even know about them. But all the kids did, Fritz's friends especially. The boys smuggled in albums we weren't supposed to have, and pictures of shiny Ford Mustangs we'd never own, and the girls got fashion magazines and colorful beaded necklaces to hide under their mattresses. So the next question is, all these things are banned, these things that seem totally normal for us in the West. And so make an inference, make an educated guess. What other common items do you think maybe would have been banned? Can I get off of that? So make an inference. And if we were in class, I would have showed you some Beatles songs. Maybe I can still post a little bit about that. But just to emphasize the differences in what they're able to express. All right. Okay. Even though she never stopped Fritz and wouldn't turn anyone in, Mama disapproved. She wanted us to buy the censored albums instead. But that missed the whole point of rock and roll. Nobody wanted approved music. I wondered if maybe Mama wasn't angry that I had seen Dominic. Maybe it made her sad, because nothing she could do would bring him home again. I never should have told her about Dom at supper, and never should have yelled. Fritz must have been thinking about that too. Mama loves them as much as you do, Gerda. She misses them so much it hurts her to talk about them. You can't be angry with her that Father is gone. He was right, of course. I didn't want to be angry, but sometimes it was the only emotion I understood. I missed my father singing to me at bedtime and the earthy smell of his coat before he left for work each morning. Sometimes he snuck a kiss from my mother when he thought no one was looking, and it always made me giggle. I even missed Dominic, the way he used to tease me and hide my dolls and jump out from behind corners to scare me. Those were good memories now. Our family was like a house of cards in a stiff wind. And when it became too much to feel the pain of our collapse, all I could do was become angry. We need to get to the West to be with them, I said. There's got to be a way through that wall. Of course there is, but the only way to know for sure is to try, and there's a high price for being wrong. Are you so certain there's a way through that you'd risk dying for it? I wanted to say yes. More than anything, I wanted to be the kind of person who dared to say yes. Papa would take the risk, maybe Fritz too, but I wasn't sure about myself. If I knew we'd make it, then yeah, I'd try to cross. Then I added, but that's all the bravery inside me. That's not how bravery works, Fritz said. Courage isn't knowing you can do something. It's only being willing to try. All right, that is a quote that I would like us to analyze in the study guide. So as we continue to read, we're going to read about somebody who does have the courage to try. And also I want to know what this quote about courage makes you think about other people in history who had to have courage. His voice trailed to silence, and the record player spat out static in the gap before the next song began. The needle on the player was going dull, and it would be a long time before Fritz lucked into finding another one. Shortages, always shortages. They're talking about a record player there. It's just a different way that they used to play music back then. Once the music began again, Fritz rolled over to face me and rested his chin on his hands. I gotta tell you something, he said. I wasn't going to, but if you really believe there's a way through the wall, you ought to hear this. I leaned forward, certain this was the secret he had kept from Mama at supper time. Do you know Peter Warner, Anna's older brother? Sure. I didn't know him well because he was so much older. He was away at the university, but I saw him occasionally on weekends. As the first in his family to attend a university, Peter made their parents very proud, and they talked about him all the time. Peter is going to the West tonight. Nobody knows about it but me. I sat up straight. Not even his family? They'll be furious. He hopes they'll understand, and maybe even be happy for him. I paused, letting that sink in. Then I asked, how is he getting out? Some students in the West got a pass to come to East Berlin for a museum tour. They're going to smuggle him out in their car. It was specially designed for that reason. I shook my head. It sounds dangerous. It is, but where we live, walking can be dangerous. Talking is dangerous. For you and me, being the children of Aldous Lowe is dangerous. That's why he never sends letters. Just because of who our father is, they probably watch you from the moment you step out of this apartment until you get inside again. If the chance came for me to leave the same way Peter is leaving, I'd take it. I felt a pinch in my chest. It was one thing to think about Anna's brother leaving, but I couldn't imagine if Fritz left too. Would he just disappear like Peter? I was about to ask when a knock came to our door. Fritz looked over at me and with a stern voice said, "Don't say a word about this. Don't make Mother responsible for knowing." When I agreed, he got up and opened the door. Mama pushed past him and turned the volume down on the record player. "They'll hear you on the streets." "Not with the windows closed," Fritz said irritably. "Besides, the police have better things to do than confiscate teenage music. And how do you know that?" "Only because they haven't come here yet to do it, that's all." Fritz nodded and then switched off the player. Neither of us was enjoying it now anyway. "Off to bed, Gerda," Mama told me. "You too, Fritz." I got up off the floor and gave Fritz a long look before leaving. Mama stopped me in the doorway and put her hands on my shoulders. "I'm sorry I became upset before," she said. "I was only worried that you might have been caught by one of the border guards. Can you understand that?" Yes, that I understood. "I'm glad you saw Dominic," she said. "I wish I could have seen him too." "He looked good," I said. "He's as tall as Fritz is now, and he looked healthy." "Did he seem happy?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer that. He must have ached about the divide in our family, just as all of us here did. But he was also free, and I wasn't sure he would give that up, even to be back with us again. So I only shrugged the question away, which seemed enough for her. She kissed my forehead, then said, "Now, good night and sleep well." I wished her a good night too, but I knew there was no chance of sleeping well. Sometime in the next few hours, the brother of my best friend would vanish into the West. I whispered a prayer that God would see him there safely, and then carry his family through the storm that was sure to follow his disappearance. All right, so again, a lot going on here. How does the quote about courage connect to Peter deciding to leave? And, what other examples in history do people have to be courageous knowing that they might fail? And then what is a question or connection that you have to the events from that chapter? And on Thursday, we'll have some small group discussions over these questions.